All right, me. It is sometime in late January. Um, it's I'm pretty sure it's the day of the WWE Royal Rumble. I think that's the day. So whatever date that is. Um, and I finished reading Hero and Leander, the Christopher Marlowe, and then George Chapman um, versions of it. It's Hero and Leander and other poems. There's like 4 extra poems at the end that are Christopher Marlowe's. So, Hero and Leander. The actual story is part of Greek mythology and then is put into Roman mythology. And it's just a pretty basic moralistic story about not defying the gods' wishes and what you promise the gods. It's a pretty basic kind of thing. But what Christopher Marlowe decides to do is I'm gonna make this into a full-fledged story. And so he takes a few liberties with everything, and basically puts this, what is basically like a 3 to 4 page short story about moralistic values in Greek Roman mythology, and is going to expand it into a full a mini epic. There's a specific word for it, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but a mini epic. It's and so he's writing this over time. He writes the first 2 sestiads, which are basically the first 2 verses, and then he dies. And at this point, the story it's somewhat completed. It's certainly different than the actual story from Greek Roman mythology. But then George Chapman picks it up, finishes it, writes the other 4 sestiads, so the total 6 sestiads, 2 of them written by Christopher Marlowe before his death, and then 4 written by George Chapman in completion. And that's that. This version of Hero and Leander is interesting in the fact that it seems to initially try to set up a happier ending to this. In the Greek and Roman version, the very, very short version, it is very much they're going and seeing each other. Leander, who is the male in the situation, is swimming across a bay every couple of nights to go see Hero, and eventually Leander loses his way, drowns. When Hero sees that, Hero then throws herself off her tower, and then they wash ashore together and are buried together. And that's really that's really it. But this version is way more. It certainly seems to be trying to set up a happier ending initially, where it seems that they're gonna somehow defeat and defy the gods in some way, which is kind of interesting when you look at where this takes place in kind of British history, right? We are looking at 1600s British history, and we're starting to see the beginning of the change to a more pluralistic and a more separatist society, a secular, instead of one that focuses really heavily on religion. We are starting to see that change here, and so maybe that's Christopher Marlowe kind of using that societal viewpoint that the British now are living through at that moment in time, and saying, yeah, well, let's now make Hero and Leander also follow that. But then when George Chapman picks it up, it does end up following more closely with the more traditional viewing of Hero and Leander and how their story ends, which is interesting. But you know, there's not much to that. There's not much you can really say about that. Hero and Leander is also interesting because these characters become kind of this archetype, and especially Hero gets referred to a lot in literature, and I think it's just because it's like this very beautiful sense of what kind of love is supposed to be. So I found that kind of interesting. Like Hero then the name Hero then gets reused by Shakespeare in Much Ado About Nothing. Leander gets changed. It gets changed into Leonardo, effectively. That's called kind of but then you know, Shakespeare also plays on the expectation that Hero and this L named character are gonna be married, but it turns out the hero's marrying a different person. Yada 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 yada. But yeah. This version, it's certainly very hard to read because it is the straight text in its poetic version with no guides whatsoever, which makes it hard to read if you're not used to reading this style and all of that. It's very hard to read. I found it much more interesting when I was translating from Latin these types of stories than actually reading this story translated by Christopher Marlowe, because it was just as really that's kind of how I feel a lot about 1600s literature. It's just kind of as you know, I think both to my personal taste, but then also speaks to how when we look at literature, we can't always compare it to what is being written currently in contemporary periods, just because the advancement of writing has gone so far. But yeah, really not much else to say. To me, you can really tell the difference between when Marlowe is writing and when Chapman is writing. You can really tell the difference. It's kind of off-putting because Marlowe is certainly, I think, is much more flowery in his language, and writes in a lot prettier of a way, but it also makes it very hard to read. Chapman is a little more practical in his words and the way that he describes things, but it's still hard to read because it is in verse. But yeah, that's Hero and Leander. I would never choose to read this again, so I'm putting it as a very low-rated book, whatever it is. You know, this is certainly one that, like, although I understand why this would be something that would be read or might be taught, I would never choose to teach this, because it just doesn't, there's nothing that connects it unless you are interested in the progression and the use of how these characters end up interplaying in later different parts of literature. And that's that.